courtroom was filled with a soft hum of whispers as people shuffled in and took their seats. The air was thick with anticipation and curiosity. Eyes flicked between the judge and the woman who had entered with quiet confidence, her every step measured and purposeful. It was not often that someone like her walked into this space. People of her background didn't belong here, not in the way she did, not in a world where power was reserved for those who had been born into it, or those who knew how to manipulate it. But she was different. The judge glanced at her briefly, his sharp eyes scanning her as he prepared himself for what he thought would be just another routine case. Her calmness unnerved him slightly, but he pushed the thought away. She would be no different from the others who came before him, people who broke the law and paid the price without question, without protest. She took her seat at the defendant's table, her eyes never leaving his. A slight tilt of her head seemed to say she wasn't intimidated by the sheer force of his reputation. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was commanding, and in that stillness was power, something that the judge could not quite place. He felt a flicker of unease, and it irked him. His gaze flickered to his notes, and he cleared his throat, ready to begin the proceedings. His voice echoed through the room as he announced the charges against her, a minor infraction according to the law, but one that carried a hefty fine far beyond the means of most people. It was a case that had no real weight in the grand scheme of things. But the judge enjoyed moments like these where his rulings could make waves. He could remind people of who was in charge and that it wasn't them. But as the words left his lips and the room fell into silence, the woman's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch, didn't even seem to process the weight of the fine that had been placed on her. No protest, no defense, just that same unwavering calm. He found it unsettling. He continued to speak, expecting her to speak up, expecting some sign of panic. But there was nothing. She simply remained silent, looking straight at him as if waiting for something, maybe waiting for him to make a mistake, maybe waiting for the right moment to speak. And then it came, her voice soft but clear, breaking through the stillness of the room. "Your Honor, I don't believe I owe this fine." It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact. And as she spoke those words, the room seemed to shift just slightly, like the air had changed. The judge frowned, unable to mask the irritation creeping into his chest. This was not how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to fold under pressure like everyone else before her. He scoffed dismissively, but she wasn't finished. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, her hand reaching into the leather briefcase she had carried in with her. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to the judge. Without a word, he took it from her, eyes narrowing suspiciously as he unfolded the document in his hands. The moment his eyes scanned the words, he knew something wasn't right. Something was off in the way the paper felt, the way it read. But he ignored the growing unease within him and continued to look. He was after all in charge here. But as the words registered, his expression faltered. His grip on the paper tightened as a realization began to settle within him like a weight that he couldn't escape. The judge's eyes scanned the document again, his fingers trembling slightly as the words became clearer, his mind racing as he processed the information in front of him. The paper was not what he had expected. It was not a defense. It was a deed, an ownership agreement that stated clearly and unequivocally that she owned the building, the very building they were in. His courtroom, her name was at the top, written in bold letters, and with it the realization that his empire was not as secure as he had believed it to be. His pulse quickened, and his hands began to sweat. The once familiar and comforting feeling of control started slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The courtroom had gone completely silent. No one dared to move as they waited for him to react, and he felt their eyes on him, every single one of them waiting for him to explain how this could be. The woman stood still before him, not saying a word, her gaze never leaving his face. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew the power she had now, and she let him feel it. She allowed the tension to grow, giving him time to process the revelation. It wasn't just the shock of the document that had him rattled. It was the simple truth that he had never considered her a threat. Before, she had been just another person who would stand before him in a courtroom, another case to be dismissed and forgotten. But now she was the one with the power, and he could feel that shift deep in his chest, a heavy pressure that was hard to ignore. He blinked several times, his throat dry as he tried to gather himself. But the words escaped him. For a moment he opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The room was still waiting for his next move. But in that instant, he realized he had no idea what to do. The fine was still there in front of him, but the woman had just flipped the script and all his usual tricks no longer applied. He could no longer rely on the authority of the court or the knowledge that he controlled the system, because in that moment the system was not his, it was hers, and he was just another player in a game he no longer understood. The woman took a small step forward, breaking the silence as she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I believe there is a misunderstanding. I am not here to contest this fine as you might think I am here, because you have made a grave error. You see, this building is mine, and with it comes a great deal of influence. I trust you understand what that means." Her words were calculated, each one landing with precision and purpose. And for the first time since she had walked into the courtroom, the judge felt a ripple of fear course through him, something he had never felt in this room, not with the many defendants who had cowered before him and begged for mercy, but now he stood before a woman who did not seek mercy, but something far more dangerous, something far more final. The audience could feel it too, the change in the air, the slow burning tension as the judge stood there unable to find his voice. And the woman continued to stand tall, her eyes never leaving his. The silence stretched on, and with each passing second it felt as though the walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. The judge's mind was spinning as the weight of the situation sank in. He was losing control, and he didn't know how to stop it. His heart was racing, his breathing shallow, and for the first time in his career, he was the one on the defensive. He tried to gather his thoughts, but the woman's words echoed in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently. He gripped the edge of his bench, the familiar coolness of the wood now feeling alien beneath his fingers. He was trying to regain his composure, but the more he tried, the more he realized how fragile his position truly was. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, invincible in this court, but she had just shattered that illusion with a single document, with a single fact. The woman stood before him unwavering and calm, her eyes steady and her posture unyielding. She was no longer just a defendant in his court. She was something else, something he couldn't quite place, yet her presence alone was enough to unnerve him. She wasn't like anyone else he had faced in this room, where most would have trembled or pleaded for mercy. She had simply handed him the truth, as though it were a weapon, and now he had no choice but to face it. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. No one moved, no one dared to speak. All eyes were on the judge, waiting for him to react, but he couldn't. He didn't know how to react, because this was no ordinary case, and this woman was no ordinary person. The judge shifted uneasily in his chair, his mind still racing, trying to find a loophole, trying to find a way out, but every possible solution crumbled before him like dust in the wind. She had anticipated everything, every move he would make, every counter he would try to put in place. She had planned for it all, and now she was watching him with a sense of quiet triumph. The longer he hesitated, the more he realized that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably in her favor. She was in control now, not him. With a sigh, the judge finally spoke, his voice shaky as he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he first laid eyes on the document. "How is this possible? How did I not know about this?" He tried to sound authoritative, but his words came out more like a question than a statement. He looked at her, as though expecting some kind of explanation, expecting her to reveal a trick or a lie, but there was none. She simply watched him as though waiting for him to figure it out on his own. She spoke then, her tone measured and deliberate. "It's simple, really. I've been building this for years, slowly, quietly, while you and others like you have been busy doing what you always do. I learned the system better than anyone else. I learned how to work it, how to use it for my advantage, and now the system is mine to control, not yours, and not anyone else's." Her words were like a breath of fresh air cutting through the dense fog of confusion in the room, and as she spoke them, the judge felt something shift again, a realization that he had been blind to the forces at work around him. He had never considered that someone like her could rise to power in this way, that someone like her could outsmart the very system that had been built to keep people like him in charge. Her words hung in the air for a moment, and the judge's face grew pale as the full weight of her meaning sank in. She wasn't just challenging him, she was upending everything he had built, his career, his legacy, his position. And now she was standing there calmly watching as it all came crashing down around him. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the judge stared at her, unable to speak. His mind was racing, trying to comprehend what had just unfolded in front of him. How had he missed it? How had he not seen the signs? The woman before him was no longer a mere defendant. She was the one pulling the strings now, and he was the puppet left fumbling for control. The weight of his own ignorance pressed down on him, and the realization that his empire could crumble so easily was almost too much to bear. He had lived his life thinking he was untouchable, but now he understood just how wrong he had been. The system that had worked for him so long had been turned against him in a single moment, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The woman remained standing at the front of the room, her calm gaze never wavering as she watched him struggle with the weight of the truth. She could feel the shift in the air, as the judge's authority began to slip away, but she didn't show any sign of triumph, no smug smile, no gloating, just a steady, calm presence that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. The judge cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence, but his voice was weak and uncertain as he muttered something about verifying the document, as though that might change the facts in front of him. But she didn't move, she didn't flinch at his attempts to regain control. She simply stood there, as if to say there was no escaping the truth anymore. Her eyes locked with his once more, and in that moment it was clear that she wasn't just here to challenge him, she was here to take everything he had worked for and rip it from his hands. She had no intention of leaving this room without securing her place in a world that had long ignored her. The courtroom felt smaller now, the once grand space now suffocating under the pressure of her presence. She had claimed the ground beneath her feet with the simple act of revealing the truth, and the judge could feel the walls closing in around him. He tried again to regain some semblance of authority, his voice shakier now as he spoke of the fine he had imposed, and how it was still valid, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they had no weight anymore. They were empty and meaningless, and she knew it too. She wasn't interested in fighting the fine. She wasn't interested in playing the same game that had been played for generations. She was playing a different game, a game where the rules didn't apply to her. The judge's attempts to assert his dominance fell flat. His words lost their power as the room's attention shifted entirely to her. The woman smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of victory, it was a smile of understanding, one that said she had known all along how this would play out, how she would walk into this courtroom and turn it on its head, how she would expose the system for what it really was. She had spent years preparing for this moment, learning every flaw, every crack in the system that could be exploited, and now it was all coming together. Her empire was ready to rise, and with it she would change everything. She took a small step forward, and the judge took a step back, as if retreating into himself, trying to find some way out of this impossible situation, but there was none. She was in control now, and he knew it. The judge stumbled slightly as he tried to regain some semblance of authority, his fingers gripping the sides of the bench, as if the solid wood could anchor him to the fading illusion of control he had spent years building, but it was slipping away with each passing second. His mind raced, trying to find some argument, something that could reverse this tide of realization that had swept over him, but all he could hear was the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The woman before him remained still, unfazed by his growing panic, her presence unwavering as she watched him struggle. It was as though she were waiting for him to come to the inevitable conclusion that there was nothing left for him to do. He tried to clear his throat, but the words felt heavy in his mouth, as if they were stuck in his chest. The very act of speaking now felt like a betrayal to himself and everything he had known. He glanced down at the document in his hand again, as if hoping to find something he had missed, something that could change the facts laid out before him, but all he saw was her name there. It was again bold and undeniable. It was her name on the deed, and with it the power that now resided in her hands. The building was hers, it was no longer his, and with it all the connections, all the influence that came with owning the courthouse itself, were now hers too. The reality was sinking in deep into his bones, and no amount of bluster or authority could change it. She tilted her head slightly, watching him with a quiet patience, but in her eyes there was something more than just calm. There was a quiet understanding that she had already won this battle before it had even begun. She had seen through the system and understood its flaws long before she ever set foot in this courtroom, and now the system was crumbling before her. Her empire had been quietly built piece by piece over years of careful maneuvering, and now it was here. She was the one in charge now, and there was no going back for anyone, not even him. The judge felt the room begin to spin slightly, his vision blurring as the weight of his own defeat pressed down on him. The power he had held for so long was now gone. It had been so fragile, so dependent on the rules of a system that had always catered to the wealthy and the powerful, but now that system was no longer his to control, it was hers, and he was a man watching the world he had known fall apart around him. With an exhale he finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. How is this even possible? The words felt weak, as if they had no real meaning, but he couldn't stop himself from asking the question. He had to know how she had done it, how she had so effortlessly taken everything from him. The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in her gaze, not triumph, not anger, but something far more dangerous, a quiet resolve. It's possible because I know the system better than anyone, and I knew exactly how to play it, she said, her voice steady, each word carefully chosen, her gaze unwavering as she continued. I spent years learning how it works, how it ends, how it breaks. And now it's mine. She let the words sink in, and the judge felt the weight of them settle over him, like a cold fog wrapping around his chest, tightening with each breath. She had seen the cracks in the system long before he had, and now she was standing on the other side of them looking at him as though he were the one who had failed to understand the game. As she spoke, the silence in the room deepened, the crowd watching as the judge's world continued to unravel piece by piece, and in that moment the reality hit him with the full force of a freight train. He was no longer the one in control, he was the one being controlled. The judge stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts, but none of them could give him a way out. The woman's words echoed in his head, and with each repetition he felt more powerless, more exposed. His entire career, his entire sense of self-worth had been built on a foundation that was now crumbling beneath his feet. He had relied on the idea that he was untouchable, that the system he served would always protect him, but she had seen through it all, and now he was just another man in the room, with no more power than anyone else. Her gaze was unyielding as she watched him struggle, and for a moment it almost seemed like she was waiting for him to collapse under the weight of it all. But he refused to give her the satisfaction. He straightened his back and took a slow, steadying breath, trying to regain some semblance of the authority he had lost. He looked down at the document again, as if searching for some hidden escape. But the words were the same, they were undeniable, and now he understood that nothing would ever be the same again. He had built his career on the backs of others, on the belief that his position made him superior, but she had come in and shown him that all of it was just an illusion. The silence stretched on, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. But he couldn't find his footing. He tried again to speak, but his voice faltered as if his own words no longer held any meaning in this new reality. The woman stood there watching him with calm eyes, not moving, not saying a word, but every second that passed made it clearer that she was in control now, not him. He had spent so long thinking he was the one who decided who was worthy and who was not, but now he was the one judged and found wanting. The crowd in the courtroom shifted slightly, as if sensing the shift in power. Even though no one said anything, it was as if the very air in the room had changed. People shifted in their seats, uneasy as they realized the game had been altered, and the rules no longer applied to them either. They too were part of a system that was now being unraveled, and the foundation that had once kept them safe seemed less certain now. The woman's lips curved into a small smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile you give when you're victorious. It was a smile that spoke of a deeper understanding of something that the judge had failed to grasp. Her victory wasn't in the fine or the building. It wasn't about winning a case. It was about something far more profound, something that had taken years to build, years of careful observation and learning, and now she was ready to use it to reshape everything. "I'm not interested in playing by the old rules," she said, her voice smooth and calm, but with an edge that made the judge shiver. "I'm not here to win a small case. I'm here to take what's mine and to show you that the world you've built doesn't belong to you anymore." She paused and let the words sink in, her eyes never leaving his face. "The people like you who think they control everything, you've been living in a fantasy, and I'm here to wake you up." The judge swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had been living in that fantasy for so long that he hadn't seen how it could be taken from him, how it could be destroyed with the simple unveiling of truth. And now it was too late. He was left standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance, and there was no way to rebuild it, no way to turn the tide back in his favor. The judge stood frozen, his mind still reeling from the force of her words, as if she had struck him with something far more powerful than any legal argument or ruling he had ever made. It wasn't just her words that cut deep. It was the cold realization that everything he had believed in was no longer valid. The system he had relied on for so long, the rules he had followed without question, they were now irrelevant, and he was left standing in the middle of a courtroom he no longer understood, surrounded by people who had no faith in the authority he once commanded. He looked around the room at the people in the gallery. Some of them had begun to shift uncomfortably in their seats, others were watching intently, but it wasn't the same kind of scrutiny he was used to. It wasn't the kind of attention he had received when he had the power to dictate the flow of the courtroom. No, now they were watching him with curiosity, and perhaps even pity, and the weight of their gazes made his stomach churn. He had always been the one to watch others squirm, the one to sit at the head of the room with all eyes on him, but now it was reversed. Now it was his turn to feel the heat of their judgment. The woman didn't speak again. She simply watched him, as though waiting for him to make his next move, waiting for him to find a way to fight back. But there was nothing left to fight with. His mind was empty, his words useless. All of his power had been stripped away, and he was just a man caught in a moment. He couldn't escape. The realization settled on him like a heavy stone pressing down on his chest. He had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered at every turn, and now he was at the mercy of someone who understood the system far better than he ever had. She took a step closer, but still didn't speak. Her presence was overwhelming now, and the room seemed to grow smaller with every step she took. It wasn't just the space in the room that felt smaller, it was everything. The walls, the ceiling, the very air around him seemed to constrict as if they were closing in around him, and there was no escape from the reality she had presented him with. There was no way out of this trap he had walked into. The silence stretched on, and in that silence he heard the echo of his own failures, the echo of all the people he had judged and sentenced over the years, the ones he had believed or beneath him, the ones who had never stood a chance in his court. But now he was the one who had lost. Now he was the one standing on the other side of the law, the one who had failed to see the cracks in the system he had upheld for so long. He finally found his voice, but it was weak and unsteady. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper, but the woman heard them clearly, and she took a moment before responding, her gaze steady as she considered him for a moment. "I want you to understand that it's over," she said softly, but with a finality that made his stomach drop. "You can't control this anymore. You can't control me or anyone else in this room. The world is changing, and you're no longer in charge." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in his life he felt utterly powerless in the very room he had once ruled, now reduced to a man standing before someone who had completely rewritten the rules. And he had no idea how to react, how to fight against a system that had already been turned against him. It was a truth that burned deep within him, and for the first time he felt the sting of defeat. The judge felt his breath catch in his throat as her words echoed through his mind. There was no escaping them, no way to undo what had been said. The finality in her voice was undeniable, and with it came the realization that he had no control anymore, no authority, no influence over the outcome of this situation. He had spent years carefully building his reputation, carefully climbing the ladder of power, but now he was nothing more than a pawn in a game he had never understood. She had turned everything upside down and left him grasping at air, trying to find something solid to hold on to. The woman's presence loomed larger with every passing second. She stood there calm and collected while he faltered under the weight of her gaze. It was as though she had become the center of the room, and everything revolved around her now. She was the one in control, not him, and it was a humbling realization, one that left him feeling smaller and smaller as the silence stretched on. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth was dry, and his throat felt tight as if something was choking him from the inside. She watched him for a long moment, and then slowly she spoke again, her voice soft but firm, her words carrying a weight that made the air around them heavy. "You don't understand yet, do you?" she said, and he looked up at her but couldn't find the strength to respond. Her eyes held his with an intensity that made him feel as if she were seeing right through him, into everything he had hidden inside himself, everything he had kept buried beneath the surface. "It's not about power, it's about control over the system and the people who think they can manipulate it without consequence. You've lived your life believing you were untouchable because you had the power to make decisions for others, but now you see that power doesn't belong to you anymore. It never did. It belongs to the ones who know how to navigate the system, not to the ones who sit at the top thinking they have it all figured out." Each word she spoke felt like a blow to his ego, a reminder of his own arrogance, his own blindness to the way the world had changed, while he had remained stuck in his ways, thinking that everything was still the same. But she had seen through the illusion long ago, and now she was here to expose it for what it really was, a system built on the backs of people like her, the ones who had been overlooked and underestimated, but who had slowly and steadily built their own power until it could no longer be ignored. The judge could feel the heat rise to his face as her words sank deeper into him. He wanted to deny them. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that he still had control over something, but the truth was there in front of him, plain and clear, and it was something he couldn't escape no matter how much he wanted to fight it. He had built his life around the belief that he was untouchable, that he was in charge of everything and everyone around him, but now he realized just how fragile that belief had been, how easily it could all come crashing down when someone like her came along, someone who understood how to break the system from within. He took a step back as if trying to distance himself from the realization, but it followed him like his shadow. He could not outrun it. It was everywhere, the walls, the floor, the very air around him, all of it was closing in, and he had no idea how to escape it. He had lost everything in an instant. Everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, it was all gone now, and there was no way to get it back, no way to undo the damage that had been done. The judge's mind raced as the weight of his defeat pressed down on him. The room felt like it was closing in with each passing second. second, and he couldn't escape the suffocating reality that he was no longer the one in control, no longer the one who held the power in this courtroom. He had always prided himself on being the one who made the final decision, who controlled the lives of those who entered this space, but now he saw the truth clearly for the first time. He was just another player in a game he didn't fully understand, and the woman before him was the one who held all the cards. He looked at her again and saw something different in her gaze now. It wasn't just a quiet confidence or a sense of victory, it was something deeper, something far more unsettling. There was no arrogance in her eyes, no sense of triumph over his downfall. It was almost as if she had been expecting this moment all along, as if she had known from the very beginning how it would play out, and how he would react to the slow unraveling of everything he had built. She wasn't here to gloat or to revel in his humiliation. She was here to make him see the truth that he had been blind to for so long. The silence between them stretched on, and it seemed to stretch the very fabric of time itself, until it felt like they were the only two people in the room. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable as the judge struggled to find something to say, something that would restore even a fraction of the power he had lost, but his mind was blank. The words wouldn't come, and for the first time in his life, he realized that no amount of words would change what was happening here. There was no quick fix, no clever argument that could undo the damage he had done. She spoke again, her voice soft and measured, but every word felt like it struck him like a hammer. You built your life on the assumption that people like you were always in control, that the system was something you could bend to your will. But you were wrong. Her words were steady, each one falling like a stone into the stillness of the room. The system isn't something to be controlled, it's something to be understood and used for the benefit of everyone, not just the few who happen to have power. She paused and let that hang in the air, and the judge felt each word land with the force of an undeniable truth. He could feel the anger rising inside him, but it wasn't directed at her, it was directed at himself, at his own failures, his own blindness. He had spent so many years looking down on people like her, thinking they were nothing, thinking they would never have the power to challenge him, but now here she was standing before him, holding the power that he had once thought was his by right. She had outsmarted him, and in doing so she had opened his eyes to the lies he had been living. The judge wanted to lash out, he wanted to scream that this wasn't fair, that she couldn't just take everything from him, but deep down he knew it was too late. The moment had passed, and there was no turning back. He had already lost, and the only thing left now was to accept that reality and face the consequences of his actions. He had spent too long taking the system for granted, believing that it would always work in his favor. But the truth was that the system was a reflection of the people who used it, and he had been blind to how it was changing while he remained. The judge stood there unmoving as the finality of the moment settled over him like a thick blanket. He had been stripped bare, exposed in a way that he never thought possible. He had always believed himself untouchable, above reproach, and yet here he was standing in a courtroom where he had once been the highest authority, now just a man left vulnerable and weak. His mind couldn't shake the realization that everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was gone. The walls that had once shielded him from the truth were shattered, and the only thing left now was the cold, harsh reality that he had been living in a lie for far too long. He glanced at the woman again. Her presence was unwavering, and for the first time he saw her not as an adversary, but as something much greater. She was a force that had been building quietly and steadily in the background, while he had been too blinded by his own power to see it. She wasn't here to destroy him for the sake of destruction. She was here because she had a vision of something more, something bigger than this courtroom, something that transcended the old ways, and she had come to make sure that vision became reality. Her eyes met his, and there was no malice there, no triumph, just a quiet understanding that this was the way it had to be, the way it had always been meant to be. She had fought for this moment, not out of hatred, but because it was time for the world to change, and the old guard like him had no place in that change anymore. The system that had once held him up was now the thing that was tearing him down, and she had come to be the one to guide it into the future. The room around them felt even smaller now. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, and the space that had once felt so vast and full of power now felt oppressive, suffocating. He could feel the eyes of the gallery on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet their gaze. He couldn't face the judgment that was now so evident in their eyes. He had been the one to pass judgment on so many others, but now he was the one being judged, and he couldn't escape the weight of it. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing he could say that would change anything. There was no defense left, no excuse he could make. He had no leverage, no power to wield against her, no argument that would sway the course of what was happening. He had been caught in his own web of arrogance, and now he was paying the price for it. The silence stretched on, and with each passing second the shame and defeat settled deeper into his bones. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she broke the silence again, her voice calm and measured. "You've had your time," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You've had your power, and now it's time for it to go to those who understand what true justice is, what true power means." She paused, and the weight of her words hit him harder than anything else she had said before. "You may have thought you controlled everything, but now you see that power isn't about control, it's about understanding and using what you have to uplift others, not to hold them down." The judge's chest tightened as he listened to her words. They were simple, but they were the truth, and for the first time in his life, he saw the full extent of his own mistakes. He had always been focused on what he could take from the system, how he could manipulate it to his advantage. But now he understood that the real power was in using the system to give to those who needed it the most, and that was something he had failed to see until now. She stood there looking at him with quiet authority, and for the first time in a long while he felt as though he were truly seeing her not as an enemy, but as someone who had the strength and wisdom to change the world. And he realized that in this moment he was nothing more than a witness to her vision becoming a reality. The judge stood there in stunned silence as her words echoed in his mind, his chest tight with a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had spent years building his life, his career on the idea that he was the one in control, that he was the one making the decisions for everyone around him, and yet here, he was nothing more than a spectator in a game he thought he had mastered. He had always believed that the system was something to be bent to his will, something that could be molded to suit his desires, but now he saw the truth so clearly it was almost painful. He had been a cog in a machine he didn't understand, and someone had come along and shown him exactly how to dismantle it piece by piece. As the moments stretched on, he felt a sense of hopelessness settle over him deeper than anything he had ever known before. It was a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, and yet in the back of his mind, there was a flicker of something, a thought that perhaps this wasn't the end of everything, perhaps this was just the beginning of something else, something new, something that could be rebuilt from the ground up. But the thought was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the magnitude of his defeat. The past he had built was collapsing in on itself, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The woman stood before him unmoving and patient, as though she were waiting for him to catch up with the reality of the situation, to understand that this was inevitable, that his time was over, and it was now her turn to lead. She had built something he could never have imagined, something that had taken years of work, years of planning, and now it was here, and he was left with nothing but the ashes of his former life. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to shout, to protest, but he knew deep down that there was no point. The people in the courtroom seemed to sense the shift too. They sat in a stunned silence, some of them unsure of what to do next, others watching intently as though waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. There was no dramatic confrontation, no fight to the finish, just a quiet acceptance of the new order that had taken root in the room. It was as though everyone had silently agreed that this was the way it was supposed to be, and no amount of resistance would change it. The woman's gaze softened slightly, but there was no mercy in it. There was only the calm certainty that she was in control now, and the judge had no choice but to accept it. "It's over," she said, her voice low and almost soothing. "The world is changing, and you can either accept it or be left behind." She took a small step back, and her eyes never left his face. "But you don't have to be afraid," she continued, her voice now tinged with something almost kind. "You can learn, you can change too. It's never too late to realize that power doesn't lie in control. It lies in understanding how to move the system forward, how to help it evolve into something that works for everyone, not just the few at the top." The judge blinked, his mind swirling with her words. It was almost too much to process, but it was clear now that everything had shifted. The game he had been playing was no longer the same, and he had two choices. Either he could accept the new reality and try to learn from it, or he could cling to the broken system that had once given him so much power and be left in the dust as the world moved on without him. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His throat was dry, and the weight of the moment was suffocating him as he stood there facing the truth he had spent so long avoiding. The judge stood there in complete silence, his mind racing, his body feeling heavy with the realization that everything he had ever known was slipping through his fingers like sand. He wanted to scream, to deny the truth that was staring him in the face, but he couldn't find the strength. The words felt too small to express the magnitude of what he was feeling. Everything he had built, his entire life, his career, his sense of self, had been shattered in an instant, and now he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own arrogance. The woman's gaze never wavered. She simply watched him, waiting for him to process everything, to understand the depth of what had happened. He could feel the weight of her eyes on him, like a pressure he couldn't escape. It was as though she was seeing right through him, into the deepest parts of his soul, parts that he had buried for years, parts that had convinced him that he was untouchable, that he was above the law, above the people he had once sentenced so confidently. She wasn't just some adversary standing before him now, she was a reflection of everything he had failed to see, everything he had failed to acknowledge. She was a force of change, and he was standing in its way, and the worst part was that deep down he knew he had been complicit in it all. He had been part of the system that perpetuated the very things that had allowed someone like her to rise up and take control. He had been too blind to see that the world was changing while he remained stuck in his old ways, too proud to notice the cracks in the foundation he had built. He could feel the suffocating weight of regret pressing on him, but even that wasn't enough to make him act, to make him speak. The truth of the moment was too much for him to handle, too overwhelming for him to confront all at once. So he stood there frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, just staring at her, his mind slowly processing the reality of what was happening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she broke the silence again, her voice calm but firm. "You're not the only one who has the power to change things." She said the words simple but profound. "You don't have to stay in this place where everything is about control. You can step forward into something new, something better, if you allow yourself to." She paused, and there was a quiet understanding between them in that moment. He didn't need to ask for an explanation. He didn't need any more words, because he already knew what she meant. He already knew that the time for fighting against change was over. It was time for him to learn how to be part of it. For the first time in his life, the judge felt something he had never felt before. He felt small, he felt vulnerable, and yet it wasn't the kind of vulnerability that made him angry or defensive. It was the kind of vulnerability that made him understand that there was room for growth, room for learning, room for change. He had spent so long living in the echo chambers of his own mind that he had never stopped to question the world around him, but now he realized how much he had missed, how much he had overlooked. The woman's words settled deep within him, and with that final shift he felt the weight of his past decisions start to fall away, as if they no longer held any power over him. He was no longer the man he had been just moments before, no longer the man who had thought himself untouchable. Now, he was just a man standing at the crossroads of his own future, wondering what would come next. The judge stood there as the weight of everything he had just experienced continued to press down on him. He had no words left, no defenses, no way to hide from the truth that had been laid bare before him. For the first time in his life, he saw the world not as something to be controlled, but as something to be understood, and in that moment he realized that the power he had sought for so long was not the kind that could be seized or hoarded. It was the kind that could only be shared and nurtured. He looked at the woman who had brought him to this realization, and for the first time he saw her not as an adversary, not as someone who had defeated him, but as someone who had shown him a path, a way forward, a way to reconcile with the world he had once thought he understood, but now knew so little about. There was no arrogance in her eyes now, no judgment, just a quiet understanding that what had happened here today was bigger than both of them. It was bigger than him, and it was something that couldn't be undone or ignored any longer. He thought back on everything he had done, the judgments he had passed, the sentences he had handed down, all those years spent in the belief that he had the power to decide who deserved what and who would be punished for what crimes. But now he saw that he had been blind. He had been so wrapped up in his own sense of superiority that he had failed to see the real injustice in a world. He had become part of the very system that oppressed and silenced those who had no voice. The silence between them stretched on for a long time, but it wasn't uncomfortable now. It wasn't the kind of silence that filled a room with tension. It was a silence that held a promise that things could change if he was willing to accept it, if he was willing to let go of the past and step into something new, something that wasn't about power or control, but about understanding and compassion. The judge finally took a deep breath, as if releasing something he hadn't even known he had been holding in all this time. He had always believed that he was in control of his fate, that he was the one who decided who would rise and who would fall, but now he saw that the truth was far more complicated than that. The world wasn't just about who had the most power or who could bend the rules in their favor. It was about finding balance, about lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. And in that moment, he understood that he could no longer be a part of the system that had built him up only to tear others down. The woman didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her silence was all the confirmation he needed, and in that silence he found a new kind of strength, one that wasn't rooted in dominance or authority, but in understanding and humility. For the first time he felt the shackles of his old beliefs fall away, and in their place something new, something powerful began to take shape inside him, a desire to make things right, a desire to help, to rebuild, not from a place of control, but from a place of compassion. As he turned to face the world outside the courtroom, he knew he would never be the same. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was no longer one he feared. It was one he would walk with a newfound sense of purpose and understanding, and for the first time in a long time he felt free.